Hi, this is Peter Dorman. Let's say a few words about the role of government in the economy. It's a big role. The government is a very important part of every modern capitalist economy. One way to measure that is as a share of income, which is about a quarter of all the income in the U.S. is taken in taxes, fluctuates with changes in tax laws and so on, but it's a useful approximation. The number is much higher in many countries, especially in Western Europe, as much as half in some countries. It's also true that government provides a substantial portion of demand for goods and services in the form of spending. As a side note, you should recognize that economists distinguish between the role of government in funneling money through taxes versus spending money. That is, some portion of tax money is simply returned to the public directly, like in Social Security checks or something like that. That's not considered government spending. Government spending occurs when the government purchases itself goods and services. So an example of that would be when the Pentagon, for instance, purchases an Air Force, planes for its Air Force or something like that. The government is big in the modern world, but it's only in relatively recent years that the government has had the ability to play a large role and to manage it. This refers to the idea of state capacity. We sometimes assume, we read back into history, for instance, and assume that governments in the past had the same ability to do things that governments today have. But that's really a big mistake. Until the last couple hundred years or so, governments had very limited capacity to take part purposefully in the economy or to regulate the economy. The three big elements of state capacity are autonomy, taxation, and civil service. Autonomy refers to the idea that the government is not in the hip pocket of some particular social group. The government has its own ability to size up the situation and do what it wishes to do. Taxation is the ability of the government to tap sources of revenue. This should never be taken for granted. In history, it's really fluctuated, the ability of governments to gain revenue. And especially in the last 200 years or so, particularly since the reforms of Frederick the Great in Prussia, which started the world down this path, though you might maybe look backwards to China, which was an inspiration for Frederick the Great, the development of autonomous professional civil service. So the idea is that you have a workforce for the government which is well-trained, which has job security, and which is really devoted to the government. It sees the government as what it's there to serve, and so they do the nuts and bolts of state capacity. Given a certain amount of state capacity, that tells you what governments can achieve if they try to achieve it. Over the long haul of history, state capacity has certainly increased. Governments are much more capable today than they were in the past. However, it's important to remember that this capacity can go down as well as up, that government leaders, like in this country, a president, who do not value or actually oppose state capacity can dismantle it. And it could take many years in order to restore the functionality of government. So what is it that governments do? Certainly, the management of the market system, indeed the creation of a market system, is a very important economic role of government. Markets exist because we have property law and contract law. Without those elements of law, you wouldn't have markets. That's a precondition. And it's not an either-or thing. It's not like you have the law or you don't have the law. There are 1,000 different decisions that have to be made every day about exactly how you define property or exactly how you define contracts and how you resolve disputes over what one thing means or how something applies to a given situation. So the government oversees that, and without that, you would be much more subject to the private use of force, for instance, that you see with the mafia in degoverned parts of Italy. Another very important area of the law for maintaining markets is tort law. If one person or business damages through its operations another person or business, that's the area of tort law. And as soon as you start demarcating the world into private property, you're going to have the potential for damage. And unless you can manage that in some way, the system will simply blow up. This isn't to say it's done well. There are many gaps and deficiencies in tort law, but it has to be done to some extent, or else the system would break down. Governments engage in public enterprise. All governments pretty much engage in public enterprise. Those enterprises may sell goods and services to the public. So the Postal Service, U.S. Postal Service, is kind of like a public enterprise in the U.S. It's semi-independent, it's semi-not independent, but it's not privately owned, it's publicly owned. Municipalities will often own utilities. We have a lot of public enterprise in the United States. The U.S. military, in a sense, is a public enterprise. It doesn't at least officially sell its services. I suppose it does unofficially in certain cases, but it's not financed by the revenues that they get from selling services. Typically, the people who are bombed don't pay the Pentagon to bomb them, but they do get money from the government to hire people and to buy equipment and to conduct their operation. Regulation is a major form of government as well. Markets do need regulation in many ways, or the economy in general needs regulation, and governments provide that service. Finally, risk management has become extremely important in the modern world. The principal area in which the government engages in that is social insurance. This is a critically important concept, and I hope you'll spend some time familiarizing yourself with it. It's often misunderstood by people. Social insurance is not a welfare system. It's not about giving people extra money to keep them out of poverty or something like that. Rather, social insurance is like any form of insurance. That is, it's risk pooling. You're taking a wide variety of different people who are likely to have different outcomes in life. You're pooling their income or a portion of their income into a giant fund and then paying out that fund on the basis of who ex post actually needs the money. So nobody knows in advance whose house will burn down or who will get flooded or who will die young or die old or get sick. We never know all these things in advance. And insurance means we simply put our money together into a big fund, and the fund pays out to the people who need it because of life events. The government is in a particularly good place to provide social insurance because it alone can make social insurance universal and cover the full range of risk of the entire society. Private insurance can never do this. So we have an example of social insurance as a social security system in the United States. It's a socialized pension system where when you're young, you never exactly know what your life course is going to be, what kind of employment you're going to get, how much you'll save. This variability is not eliminated entirely by Social Security, but it's moderated. So the people who have bad luck in life and are not able to save as much come out ahead. The people who have very good luck and are able to save more come out a bit behind. But you never know in advance what your luck is going to be. So it's a way of evening out the results across different outcomes that people face in life. The final point that I'd like to make about government is that when we talk about the relationship between market and government, it's really useful to have in mind a distinction that was first voiced by Albert Hirschman in his book Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. And that is between exit and voice, which are two different ways of having an input into the kinds of decisions that are made that affect you. The exit option means you use the threat of exit as a way to influence how you're treated. So if you don't like your cable company, for instance, and if there are competing cable companies, which there often aren't, but if there were, then you could tell your cable company, I'm sorry, if you don't do this for me, I'm going to go to the other cable company or cell phone provider or whatever the service is. And of course, that occurs every day without even having to make announcements in the market for goods that you might find on the supermarket shelf. Your attitude is that if they change the formula for a particular canned good that you buy, you don't like the way they do it now, well, you won't buy that anymore. You'll buy something else. Your threat to leave to buy something else is what influences the decision-making of the business that wants to sell to you. That's how markets work, and that is the exit mechanism. Markets function on the exit mechanism. Voice is influencing decisions directly by expressing yourself and participating in whatever process there is for hearing people and in making decisions. So it means staying with an organization, not leaving the organization, but staying with it and showing up and making your opinion heard, working on committees, doing whatever is possible to present your views on how things should be done to the organization. So markets, again, are based on the threat of exit, especially in the form of competition. Democratic participation, which is in theory what governments ought to be based on, whether or not they are, but government decision-making should be based on voice. That is, you would influence a company or a government or whatever you're talking about by staying with it and taking part in its internal decision-making mechanism. And corresponding to this distinction, then, there's a distinction between two political philosophies called liberalism and corporatism. So liberalism is a political philosophy based on the effectiveness of exit. The idea behind liberalism is that really you can't do much about internal processes of organizations. They'll be self-interested, they'll do whatever they do. The only way you can really have an impact is by threatening to leave. So liberalism sees markets as a useful disciplining device on corporate power. In fact, really the only disciplining device. An example of that would be, for instance, getting a label, like a fair trade label or an organic label on a product. We use the threat of exit to force corporations to be more socially responsible. Because if they're not, we'll go to some other product that does have the label. We'll use our exit power, and that will get them to change their behavior. Corporatism, on the other hand, is based on the belief that through some form of voicing of opinion, discussion, collaboration, deliberation, organizations can be made more democratic, and therefore we can influence outcomes in that way. So an alternative to the use of labels, for instance, to get corporations to change their behavior would be to have a government regulation, where the government regulation, if it were well devised, would come out of a process which enabled people who cared about the issue to have input into it. So for instance, the Environmental Protection Administration, when it comes up with a regulation for how a particular product should be made, typically publishes a draft of the regulation. They invite comments from people. Anybody can comment. They have expert panels. Typically it's litigated, it goes before the courts. They have to demonstrate to the courts it was a rational process, and so on and so forth. So there's a political process behind the EPA regulating a company, whereas if you want to regulate the company through the market, what you do is you create a label for the product, and then you use that kind of information source for people to threaten to leave that product if it doesn't have the label. I would advise you on this that the word liberalism here is used in its political theory sense. That is, it's the idea that comes from hundreds of years ago of individual freedom, negative freedom, to use that term. It's more market-oriented. It's hostile to the use of government. Corporatism is not used to talk about corporate power, but rather, again, is used in the political sense. It's the notion of a society where organized interest groups, workers or consumers or people, environmentalists, groups that share a common interest, can come together in a deliberative process through government and regulate or control what happens economically or otherwise in that society. Clearly, it's not an either-or choice. You don't have to be 100% liberal or 100% corporate. You could decide that one particular system works better for one type of problem and another system works better for another, or you can have a mixed system for any given problem. So it's obviously a whole field to investigate and think about, but it begins with this initial distinction.